So we'll start just at the top and kind of work our way down with these different network components here, or not network components, but interface components. You know what I mean. So, okay, the top component, you could say, is the menu bar, which is pretty standard on most systems. There's a selection of different drop-down menus that you can use to do all kinds of things within Wireshark. So just going from left to right, the most important things that we can use are, of course, the file drop-down, which is, it behaves just like most programs. You can open capture files. You can save capture files. There's export options here where we can export specified packets, for instance, packet bytes, objects from network traffic, and so forth. So there's export options, save options, open options. You know, we can print things as well. All the normal stuff that you'd expect to see in the file menu. So moving over from there, the edit menu gives us a lot of nice options. So first off, we can mark and unmark packets if we want to kind of save them for later and find them more easily. We can mark them. We can select a packet and mark it, or we could just use Control-M. So Control-M provides the same functionality here. And this is just a way to basically highlight a packet for maybe, so we could come back to it later and see what's going on with it. So also within the edit menu, there's the ability to comment packets, which is, again, something that we can do by selecting a packet and going to edit packet comments, or we can just do Control-Alt-C. So when we do that, and I'll just do the shortcut because that's a lot easier, Control-Alt-C, we can add comments to packets as well. So if we're going through a pretty complex dissection and we don't want to have to remember everything, we don't have enough sort of RAM in our head to remember everything that's going on, we can comment these packets. And it's also useful if we're maybe collaboratively looking at a packet capture and we want to comment for other people. So the ability to comment on packets is a great tool for collaboration and also just keeping things straight in our heads. There's also configuration profiles, and this is probably one of the best tools available. Again, you can access the configuration profiles via the edit line, but there's also right down here a little selector where you can switch between configuration profiles. But what are configuration profiles? Well, essentially, network traffic's really complicated, and the type of organization of the interface that we might use for one type of traffic isn't going to be the same type as we use for another type of traffic. So right now we're using this default organization of the columns and the colorization that comes with Wireshark. But just as an example, I made this profile 2 here, this other configuration profile that is slightly different. So let's take a look at that. And as you can see, the columns are very different now. We've got new columns. We've gotten rid of some other columns that were in the previous configuration profile. So this time we've got the absolute time, the time sort of relative to the beginning of the capture of packets. And we've also got this delta time, which is the difference in time between receipt or transmission of packets. So the time in between each packet. So this delta time, which is named incorrectly, so let's take a look at how to actually fix that. The delta time is actually a great way of picking out and finding out where latency might be cropping up. So if we sort by delta time, not relative time, but delta time, we can see that the highest relative time between packets here is 6.335 something seconds, which is a lot of time. So if you sort by this time between packets, you can kind of pick out, is there some sort of latency being introduced in the network? But as you can see, this isn't labeled correctly, because technically the relative time, if we organize these again just by packet number, the relative time is the time from the beginning of the packet capture. So when I made this column, I misnamed it. So how do you add columns? How do you fix them when you misname them like I did? Well, to do that, you can go to Edit Preferences, just right under Configuration Profiles, and Columns. And here within Columns, you can add columns, remove columns, or just deselect columns if you don't need them for your particular use case. So to change the name on a column, you can just double click the name, and I'll call it delta time, so that we know it's actually the time between packets and not the overall time since the beginning of the capture. So now if I click OK, it's now changed to delta time here. And just to show you, if we wanted to make another configuration profile for some other protocol, the way to do that is we go to configuration protocols in the edit drop-down menu, as I mentioned, and press the plus sign. And we'll just name this one, we can name it just profile 2. I'm not very creative, if I'm honest. So we'll name that, I'm very not creative because I already got a profile 2. So profile 3, we'll name it profile 3 and click OK. And it starts off with this default profile. This is the default profile that comes with Wireshark. And the first thing we can do is make the text a little bit bigger using Control-Shift+, so it's a little bit more readable, which is one of the attributes or traits that's actually saved with the configuration profile. The size of the text will, if we go back to the default profile here, the size of the text, and let's make it a little bit smaller actually. So if we go from the default profile to profile 3, you can see that the size of the text has also changed between configuration profiles, which is kind of handy. But let's make this configuration profile here. So now that we've selected profile 3, and you want to make sure that it's selected right down here on the bottom, the correct profile that you want to modify. So it's selected as profile 3. Now we can go to preferences and edit our columns if we want to. We can add a column. So let's see what our options are here. So we can add things like resolved network addresses, resolved hardware addresses, which is when Wireshark uses the OUI or the first half of the MAC address to figure out what the manufacturer is. We can add destination ports, TCP ports, UDP ports, source ports. Let's just add a destination port here just to demonstrate this. And we'll call this destination port. You kind of want to keep the titles a little short because if the title is super long, then that limits how much you can compress the columns without sort of cutting off the name of the actual column. So now we've got destination port, and if we want to move it up to maybe, let's see here, we'll move it to right after the destination address, and we can click OK. And now you can see we've got this destination port column here. But maybe we want to further modify this. Maybe we want to center the column. We can actually do that by right-clicking the column and choosing Align Center or Align Left. So you can change the alignment in these columns as well. And so this is all saved to Profile 3 now. If we go back to Profile 2, that has been untouched. If we go back to the default profile, that's also untouched. So when you're changing profiles, again, down here, you want to make sure that you've selected the right profile when you're about to modify it. So this is obviously a really powerful tool with Wireshark because it allows us to customize our workflows and get the information, the columns that we need for the particular thing that we're trying to solve or the particular protocol that we're trying to analyze. So it's very, very useful. When I found out about configuration profiles, I got maybe a little bit more excited than I should have. So that's fun to play around with, and there are actually websites, if you Google it, there are configuration profiles pre-made, and you can download them and import them into Wireshark. And the way to do that is to first find the configuration profile you want. For instance, you might find a configuration profile that is specifically made for ARP traffic. And then once you've found it, you download it. And if you go to configuration profiles and click this link here, to the file path of where one of these configuration profiles is, it will pull up in Windows Explorer the path of that particular profile. And then if you just go up one level to profiles, you can see we've got these two profiles here. The default profile is not shown by default. And you can just drag new profiles that you've downloaded off the internet in there, and then you have access to them. So you could download an ARP specific profile, an HTTP specific profile, and the list kind of goes on from there. So very, very useful to take advantage of that. So continuing on from the edit drop-down menu, we've got the view menu, which allows us to modify things like the time display format. So one thing you might want to do is, instead of showing the time here as seconds since the beginning of the capture, you can show it in maybe UTC time. So let's see, or how about, why don't we do, UTC time a day. And now you can see, instead of showing the relative time from the beginning of the packet capture, we've got this absolute time when these packets were captured. So that's also very useful depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to synchronize multiple captures and see what's going on at a broader view, maybe at multiple points on the network, you could synchronize, you could use UTC time to ensure that the packets are all relative to the same time frame. That's the sort of absolute time frame, UTC, as opposed to just whenever those packet captures were started. So that's one option in View. We can colorize and decolorize our packet list as well, if you'd like to do that. And another thing that you may want to do in terms of customization is changing coloring rules. So you can make display filters, which we're going to cover in a different lesson, but you can make display filters to match certain characteristics of a packet. So for instance, ARP, the display filter for ARP, if you just want to show ARP packets, is just ARP. So as you can see here, we've got this ARP display filter, and the name of the colorization rule is ARP, naturally, and we've got these colorizations here. So if we click it, we can actually modify the colorization of this particular type of traffic so that it's easier to pick out. So that's a very nice thing to do as well. And that's another thing that will be saved with your configuration profiles. So very, very nice to make things a little easier to understand visually more quickly than having to read, for instance, just the protocol column. So we've got colorization rules here, and of course we can even colorize specific conversations as well. So with this HTTP conversation, if we click it and go View, Colorize Conversation, Color 1, now we've colorized this specific TCP or HTTP conversation so that we can pick it out from other traffic on the packet capture. So that's a very nice way to highlight packets as well. So we can resize columns. We can automatically resize columns if we don't like these lengths here, or if they're overlapping in a way that we don't like. We can sort of set it back to a default of sorts by doing this. So you do reset columns or resize columns, and it will sort of space them out a little bit. But as you can see, that's not necessarily ideal, because the columns, the way they're spaced, it looks like these three columns are just one long string of text. So not necessarily ideal, but it's something you can do if you just messed your columns up a bunch and you want to get back to sort of a baseline state. So with View, that's all I wanted to point out with View, although there is one more thing I'd like to point out. First off, we can turn off this packet bytes information down here, because most people don't necessarily need to know the packet bytes or the individual bits of the packet. We're really interested in this dissected view of packets that we have here. So if you don't want to view that, if you want to open up some screen real estate, you can turn off packet bytes or packet details if you want to do that. But just make sure that you know that that's an option as well. So packet bytes are not necessarily as useful as this the packet detail pane that we have here. So there's also a Go drop down that is, for the most part, not something that you use, because usually it's for things like moving between packets, which we've got hotkeys for. So if you use Go, like go to the next packet, it can get a little tedious to do it that way, right? So typically we're going to use something like Control down to move between packets, or Control up. There's different hotkeys that we use, or alternatively we just use our scroll wheel and our mouse. So the Go drop down doesn't have the most useful stuff, but there is one thing that I want to point out, and that's the auto scroll. So if we have a live capture going on and we're at the bottom here, if auto scroll is enabled, as each packet comes in, the packet list pane here, this is the packet list pane, will automatically scroll so that the newest packets are always on screen. And if you disable auto scroll, then if we're sort of like somewhere up in the middle of the packet capture and we're still capturing packets, it's not going to continue to scroll as more packets flow in. So you may want to enable or disable that functionality depending on what you're trying to do. There's also Analyze here, and Analyze is pretty cool. So probably the best thing about Analyze here is that we can do things like this. Let's scroll up, and let's say, you know, for this conversation, for let's say DNS here. We'll click this DNS packet, and we'll go to the UDP dropdown of the packet detail pane. What you can do is actually select any of these fields within a packet. So we'll select this destination port here, and if you go to Analyze and Apply as Filter selected, now we've got this filter that is just filtering for what we selected. So only packets that have a destination port of 53, of UDP 53, are going to be displayed. And then we can remove the filter by clicking this red X right up here. So that's a nice tool. So Analyze, there's an easier way of doing it. So what I would show you is, instead of going ahead and going into packet detail and selecting the field that you want to filter by, what you can actually do is just, for instance, if you want to filter by a destination IP address, you can just right click on any of these particular data points. So like this IP address, if you right click this and then do Apply as Filter right here, selected, it will filter by that IP address. So you don't need to go into the packet detail and select a particular field and then go to Analyze and click Apply as Filter. If it's on these columns, you can just right click what you want and apply that as a filter. Or if it's not on these columns, you can go into packet detail and then apply as a filter as well by right clicking any of those packet details in there. So very nice to have that. And so what we did right there, we right clicked IPv4 and applied that as a filter, which really didn't filter anything because it's all IPv4 traffic. So it's not the most useful filter, but that's the kind of thing you can do with Wireshark. That's pretty cool. The statistics dropdown gives us a lot of, well, statistical and reporting tools, and there's actually a separate video on this, so we're not going to go into this in depth. But some of the things you can do is break down the whole packet capture statistically, like what portion of this packet capture is UDP, what portion of it is TCP, what portion is IPv4, what portion is IPv6. So we can break down the traffic and see what is exactly going on with it. And there's other statistical tools as well that we'll be going over in a later lesson. So it's not just about drilling down to individual fields in a packet or individual bytes in a packet. It's also about the ability to take a whole packet capture and analyze that as a single like monolithic entity. So it's not just about fine details. There's also some broad strokes information that we can distill using Wireshark. There's a telephony dropdown if you want to work with sort of voice over IP traffic as well. You can decode it, you can do statistics about it. We're not going to go into this in any great detail, but there's great resources on the Wireshark wiki and on other websites if voice over IP is something that you need to debug. And then there's also wireless dropdown that deals with, you know, wireless local area network traffic as well as Bluetooth. And then tools. This is one of my favorite dropdowns here. So tools, what I want to point out on this one is, in particular, firewall ACL rules. So let's look at this. Let's select a packet here. Say we want to block just DNS, which I don't recommend ever blocking DNS. That's pretty important, and not much stuff seems to work without DNS. But let's just select a DNS packet here and go to Tools, Firewall ACL Rules. And it's kind of small, so I apologize for that. But what we can do is we can generate access control list rules or firewall rules depending on the packet that is selected. And we can generate it in multiple formats. So there's this net filter rule set that we can use, but there's also Cisco iOS. We can do a standard access control list for Cisco iOS. And if we click that, now we've got this Cisco access control list that we can just copy and paste onto a router and use that to filter a specific type of traffic. We don't have to make the access control list ourselves. So that's a very cool feature.